Okay, hello everyone. My name is Wesley, this is Wu Can Cook. Today we're doing a Szechuan stir-fry dish called mapo tofu, which is kind of like a, really popular and very commonly found dish here in the States. That's probably the thing that you most commonly associate with Szechuan food, or uses the thing that you probably most commonly associate with Szechuan food, which is some Szechuan peppercorn. We're going to take a look at that. What exactly is Szechuan peppercorn and how it's so iconic. So we're going to dive into all of those things. It also happens to be the very first recipe that I ever published on this YouTube channel. So if you're watching on the YouTube channel, you can scroll all the way back to the very beginning of that YouTube channel. And it's somewhere floating around there. And it looks really bad because I hadn't figured out color correction and stuff yet. But it's up there still, so if you're interested in that, you can pop over to the YouTube and find that stuff. The recipe that we're following today, obviously, as I just mentioned, it lives over on the YouTube channel, so if you're interested in that, you can hop over and find that stuff. That's over at youtube.com/WuCanCook. Lots of fun stuff coming up. Those are out every Friday, so if you're looking for stuff like that, that's a fun place to start. Last Friday, we came out with our Pantry Basics episode, which was basically an episode dedicated to diving into all of the things that go into these recipes and like what are all of the ingredients that we're putting into them and like why are there so many of them, because I know that there's a lot of things that go into a lot of these recipes, stuff like that. So that was out last Friday. This Friday coming up, we're doing a Chinese xiaolongbao, which is a Chinese soup dumpling, or like I think soup dumpling is like the colloquial thing that most people call it here in the States, at least. That's coming out this Friday, and lots of stuff like that coming up. So if you're interested in stuff like that, hop over to the YouTube, check out what's going on over there. All right. But in the meantime, diving in, so we're starting off. So the recipe that we're following today is one that I assembled that's loosely inspired by, or not really, I guess inspired, but mostly just like trying to figure out the mapo tofu that my grandma used to make when I was a kid. Which had so my grandma's Chinese, obviously, so she had a lot of like relatively authentic things going on, but it also did a lot of things that you generally wouldn't find in a mapo tofu. It's definitely Americanized, and then also just made a lot of choices that were probably influenced by the fact that she was trying to get a bunch of kids to eat it. I think, honestly. In a couple of ways, she was basically trying to make it look more like a chili, I guess, because that's how you get a bunch of 8-year-old kids to eat mapo tofu. But there's a couple of other things going on. Mainly the thing that I always associated with it is that it's a little bit sweeter than your standard mapo tofu. I always remember that it was a little bit more sweet than the other mapo tofus that I came across in most Chinese restaurants. Definitely not quite as spicy. Because again, probably because she was trying to get a bunch of kids to eat it. So we're gonna take a look at all that stuff today, and how I kind of have like worked out how to reproduce my grandma's mapo tofu, which to this day I have no idea what was in it. But this is the closest that I've gotten. So here we are. As with most of our stir fries, we're starting off. That was 4 cloves of crushed and minced garlic that I just finished chopping. And next, this is going to be 1 inch or about a tablespoon of finely minced ginger, which we're starting off by large dicing like so. And then for our mince, we can run our knife through it, as long as our knife is nice and sharp. If you don't like doing minces, you can also grate this stuff. Or if you really don't like grating, you can probably buy pre-grated ginger. In my experience, the pre-grated ginger, it actually works okay. It's not like, so the pre-minced garlic, that stuff doesn't taste like anything. So what happens when they pre-mince garlic, so they're essentially like they boil it to get the skins off, and then they preserve it in oil. And what happens when they preserve it is that all of the allicin comes out. So the allicin is basically, you can think of it as like the juice of your garlic. And when it comes out, it's basically coming out into that oil. So when you cook with it, it doesn't really taste like anything. So I've used that pre-grated stuff once or twice before, and I think there was one point, like mid-pandemic, or like early in the pandemic, where for whatever reason garlic was really hard to find. So I was using this pre-grated stuff for a while. And I think at one point I was using like half a jar at a time, and I still couldn't taste any of the garlic. So. But the ginger, I found pre-grated ginger, it seems like it works okay. Cool. So that's our garlic and our ginger. Then next up, we're going to dive into some green onions here, which we do a lot. These happen to be very, very fresh green onions, so that's very lucky of us today. But what I like to look out for, even on fresh green onions, because a green onion, as you'll notice, it still has the root here at the bottom. These are just straight up the end of the green onion that goes into the soil. Because it still has that root attached, it still continues to grow. So stuff like this will happen, where you notice it kind of grows off into a really, really fine point. So this fine point up here, it tends to get really, really bitter if you try and cook it. At least in my experience, I don't like eating that really fine point because of how bitter it gets. So I like to chop that off. So just the stuff like this, when it starts getting really, really tapered off, I like to just give that a chop and toss it. And then what I'm doing here, so I just separated, these are the whites of my green onions. And we're going to give this, I guess like a slice for slicing these. Not super thin. These are going to go into our wok fry because they're a little bit more durable and like rigid. They have a lot of rigidity to it, which means that when we throw it into our wok fry, they're not going to just completely disintegrate. If we were to try and throw these greens into our wok fry, it would pretty much just fall apart immediately. So we don't want to do that. But for our whites, you'll generally see me a lot of times referring to these three as our aromatics, especially in Chinese cooking. That's our garlic, our ginger, and then the whites of our green onions. You'll see me refer to all three of these a lot as the aromatics. They're going to end up being the very first three things that go into our wok fry super, super often. And then next up, what we're going to do is we're going to take these greens and then we're going to slice them real thin. So we're going to use these as a garnish. So what I like to do when we use green onions as a garnish is slice them as thinly as possible on a very, very wide bias. So that bias cut, because they're so wide, it helps the green onion sort of occupy a really, really large space. And then you get these nice wide pieces of green onion that have a lot of physical presence, and which is nice because the green onions themselves, they don't really taste like a lot. They're not flavorless, but because it's just the leafy portion of the green onion, it doesn't have a whole lot of flavor. So if you let it sort of occupy a little bit more physical space, it will do something more impactful, like so. So that's our greens. We're going to set these aside. And these, again, are going to be our garnish. So by the way, if we're paying attention to cross-contamination, I've been taking a food handlers management course. So I've been learning lots about food handlers safety. If you're paying attention to food management or cross-contamination, this is the one thing that should stay very, very far away from your raw meats, because this is the only thing that's not going to get cooked today. So in most cases, when we're cooking, the cook from what we're putting on heat, that heat is going to keep it's going to kill off most of the bacteria and stuff that grow in meat, so things like E. coli and salmonella. For the stuff that doesn't get cooked, though, that's the stuff that we have to be very, very careful. That stuff will absolutely harbor bacteria because it's not getting cooked. Next up is my favorite type of tofu, which is soft tofu. Mapo tofu, by the way, is my favorite use of tofu because it doesn't treat tofu like a meat. So lots and lots of times I see folks, they ask me for vegetarian versions of lots of things that we're doing. So they ask how to sub tofu in for a lot of the things that we do chicken or beef with, which I really have a strong distaste for. I really don't like it when people try and treat tofu as if it were meat and then expect to have the same results, because it's never going to work. Because I feel like this is very obvious, but it seems like something that needs to be said. Tofu is not meat, so it doesn't taste like meat. It will never taste like meat, so stop expecting for it to taste like meat. But in a mapo tofu, even though it does contain meat, it also contains tofu, and it treats that tofu a little bit differently. So we're not going to do anything to this tofu in the same way that you would with a piece of chicken, for example. We would marinate it and then probably sear it, maybe do a pan fry. You might deep fry it. All of these are things that you do for meats. For this tofu, we're literally just going to drop it in just like that. It's just going to go straight in, and it's just going to be almost like it's a garnish. It's going to go in right at the very, very end. That's my favorite approach to using tofu, which is the way that you'll see lots of Chinese food approach tofu, which is basically treating that tofu as if it were tofu and not as if it were meat. All right. Next up here, we're going to, yeah, let's do our sauce. No, let's do our meats first. Sorry. So next up, I'm going to marinate. I'm going to get the marinade going on my ground pork. So what my preference for this particular dish is to use ground turkey, mainly because I honestly can't taste a huge difference, and turkey's a little bit cheaper than ground pork. That's probably like the main reason why I like to use ground turkey. Today we're using ground pork, but that's almost just only because I ran out of turkey, so we don't have turkey today. So we're going to be using some ground pork today, but if you don't have ground pork, ground chicken will work, ground turkey will work. Yeah, ground turkey, ground pork, ground beef will work. Really what we're looking for is any kind of ground mince that has a large quantity of fat in it. So we want very, very fatty cuts of meat for this particular instance, so that it has a nice juicy quality to our stir fry. So we're going to do a real quick marinade here. This is just 4 tablespoons of soy sauce. Oops. Followed by, this is going to be 1 tablespoon of, or half a teaspoon of white pepper. There it is. So white pepper. And then finally, just a pinch of kosher salt. You'll see me supplementing the soy sauce that I use with a little bit of salt. The reason for that, it's not absolutely necessary, but the reason for that is because most of the time that I'm using soy sauce, especially when I'm cooking, I'm probably using low sodium soy sauce. That's what I'm using today too. A reason that I use low sodium soy sauce is because I find that you can be a little bit more heavy-handed with it. You don't have to worry about over-seasoning with low sodium soy sauce quite as much. So lots of times you'll see me, especially in marinades like this, you'll see me adding a little bit of salt to it. That's just because the soy sauce is missing a little bit of salt, so it benefits. Last thing that we're going to add here, I totally forgot to do it, but we'll do it now. This is going to be half a teaspoon of cornstarch. So this, by the way, is also the same marinade that you will see come up a lot in a lot of the Chinese recipes that I do. Mostly because it's just sort of like what the marinade that I use when I can't think of what else to do in a marinade. But essentially, that white pepper kind of helps bring out some aromatic qualities to the meat. Soy sauce is pretty baseline in most marinades. And that cornstarch is just going to sort of slow down the exterior cook of our meat a little bit, so that when we get to cooking, things don't start overcooking, which happens a lot in a lot of wok frying because of the high heat in your wok. Yeah. All right. So next up, we're going to assemble our sauce here, which we're starting off. This is going to be 4 tablespoons of soy sauce. This, by the way, is something that you can also buy pre-made in a lot of stores. I don't really like that pre-made stuff, but if you're really, really lazy, you can probably do it. Probably the most important thing in mapo tofu next to the tofu is going to be what should be in your more traditional mapo tofu recipes. 2 tablespoons, 1 tablespoon? 1 tablespoon of doubanjiang, which is a Chinese fermented chili paste. Today what we're using instead is some gochujang, which is the Korean equivalent of doubanjiang. It is pretty similar in that it still contains quite a bit of heat, like very, very aggressive umami, and like in your face, like punch you in the face stuff. But it has one unique quality to it in that it is a little bit sweeter and not quite as spicy as doubanjiang, in my opinion. So I find that by using that gochujang instead of the doubanjiang, you kind of add a little bit more brightness, a little bit more sweetness to the recipe in the way that kind of reminds me of how my grandma was doing it. I'm very confident that she was not using gochujang. I'm pretty sure she was probably just using sugar, but because I don't think my grandma knew what gochujang was, but here we are. That was a single tablespoon of sesame oil, and then this is next 2 tablespoons of mirin. Mirin also, by the way, it's coming from Japanese cuisine. It's sort of a sweet rice vinegar, a sweet rice wine, so it's bringing a little bit of acidity to it, but also bringing a little bit of sweetness to it again, trying to drive to that sweet quality. Assemble, yeah. Assemble the gang. Cool, next up, this is going to be, how many? 2 tablespoons of rice vinegar. So just sort of supplementing that brightness that comes from our mirin. Then rounding things out, this is going to be a single tablespoon of oyster sauce. And that's going to give us a little bit of like earthy and like fishy umami. Obviously, it is derived from oyster. I learned recently that it is not actually derived from the fermentation of oyster, but it is actually derived from the reduction of oysters. So basically, essentially, somebody at one point cooked some oysters and then just reduced it until it turned into a syrup, and that's how you got that. And then last up, in my opinion, maybe the most important ingredient in this particular dish, or in this particular version of mapo tofu, which is going to be some spicy black bean paste. You can get black bean paste from many, many distributors. It's pretty commonly found in a lot of Chinese places, or Chinese restaurants. Oops, I just spilled that. But this particular black bean paste is made by Lao Gan Ma, which is the same stuff that makes the hot sauce, so the chili crisp oil that we eat a lot. So what we're using is their black bean paste, which is essentially black bean paste that's been cooked in their chili oil. So it adds this nice, like, interesting depth of flavor to it. If you can't find this particular one, you could just use black bean paste and then include a little bit of Lao Gan Ma, which would be nice as well. Yeah. Love it. Oh, yeah, thank you. Cool. And yeah, that's it. Cool. So next up, what we're going to do is switch to a fork. So you'll notice that a lot of the things that we just added here, I make this mistake all the time, is try and break up these clumps with a spoon, which is not going to work. So especially that gochujang, you'll see it has all of these big old clumps going on. We want to make sure and break that stuff down. We don't want any solids going into our wok fry from here, because that's going to clump up and then you'll bite into a big old clump of gochujang, which we don't want. So what we want here is as smooth and liquid of a texture that we can possibly get. There's still going to be some clumps because those black beans are solid, but for the most part, we want a smooth and liquid sauce. All right. So last up, what we're going to do is assemble our cornstarch slurry, which is sort of the one thing that you'll probably consistently see me using in basically at least the Chinese stir fries. But I would say almost every stir fry that we ever do that has a sauce base to it, we're going to do one of these cornstarch slurries. This is going to be essentially how we get nice thick and like thicker and more luxurious qualities to our cornstarch. To our sauce base. Is because the starch from our cornstarch is going to start thickening that sauce base up. What's a good cheap wok? Oh yeah, good question. Lots of people ask me that. So the wok I'm using today is behind me. Up here. I got this at a restaurant supply store. It's really, really cheap. If you're near a Chinatown neighborhood, what I love recommending is that if you find yourself in a Chinatown neighborhood, like here in Oakland, there's a Chinatown here in Oakland, there's also one in San Francisco. But anywhere that you'll find a Chinatown neighborhood where there's lots of Chinese restaurants, there has to be a store that sells those Chinese restaurants goods. So like a restaurant supply store that's specifically designated for Chinese wares. And that's where I got this wok, which means that if you're buying it from a restaurant supply store, it's going to be purchased basically at wholesale. So that I think I own like 5 of these because they're the same woks that we use in our food pop-up. And I think I got them all for like $12 or something, which is nice. And it works really great. It's basically just a piece of carbon steel that's been shaped into a wok, which is really nice. So what I always recommend when people ask me about woks is just find your nearest Chinatown district and look for the restaurant supply store that's supplying those restaurants with things. It'll be the same place that they like get like to-go boxes and bags and like forks, like teapots, stuff like that. They're also getting their woks. So if you find wherever that supply store is, if you're here in Chinatown, Oakland, there's a spot on 8th and Webster. It's called Chenko. That's where I got this one. But if you're near any Chinatown neighborhood, there's going to be a similar one somewhere nearby. If you don't live nearby one, or if you can't find a Chinese restaurant supply store, I've heard a lot of good things, and I have actually used used it before too. The Joyce Chen carbon steel wok, which you can get on Amazon. I think it's like 30 bucks or something, and it works really great. A friend of mine has one, and I've used it a little bit. It works really nicely. Cool. So let's see. Velveting, yeah, that's essentially what velveting. Velveting is a little bit more involved with cornstarch. I think velveting also would technically involve baking soda, and is more commonly done with like steaks. So I did it. I think the last time I did it was the Mongolian beef recipe that we did, where you would essentially take like a really chewy cut of steak, like flank steak. I think I used flank steak or Angus sirloin. I forget, one of the two. And then you add a little bit of baking soda to it. And I don't remember any of the food science that goes behind this, but basically what's happening is the baking soda stops the proteins in that steak from binding together and gives you a more like tender piece of steak. And then you include a little bit of cornstarch with it, and it kind of like slows down that exterior cook a little bit, and it gives you like this really nice crispy but also tender piece of steak. You can do the same technique for chicken or pork, ground mince, really anything that is a meat. So yeah, velveting, I think it's a little bit more involved than what we just did. That was more like just I threw some cornstarch in it, but velveting is a little bit more involved. You kind of have to like give it some time. Oh yeah, go to the one in New York City for sure. Yeah, you're in the right place. All right, so the first thing that I'm going to do here, so our wok is heating up, and the very first thing that I like to start with before anything goes into this wok is we're going to dry toast our Szechuan peppercorns, which is, as the name implies, the key ingredient to most Szechuan food is going to be your Szechuan peppercorn. So what I like to do, especially if you've got whole peppercorn grains like the ones that we're using right now, is just to add it to, you could do this in a skillet too if you want, or just with like a dry pan. What's most important is that whatever you do it in, it has to be dry. So we don't want this to be toasting in oil, because that technically wouldn't be toasting. That's just, that would basically just be frying. But we're going to dry toast these, and what's going to happen because these are dry spices is that all of the flavor of those Szechuan peppercorns are going to start blooming out. You don't have to do this. Oftentimes you'll see me skipping this step. But I find that it kind of brings out a lot of the flavor in that Szechuan peppercorn that otherwise just sort of falls into the background of your dish a lot. So before anything gets into the wok here, I'm going to add it. I'm adding it to our dry wok, and then we're just going to give it maybe like 30 seconds or so. Mainly what we want to do, especially if the wok is a little bit hotter than I'd like it to be, is that we're just giving it a lot of motion here. If it stays still for too long, the peppercorns are going to start burning, which we don't want. All right, so that's our peppercorns. I'm adding it. This is a mortar and pestle, and then we're just going to sort of give these a crush, and then these are going to be our finishing element on our mapo tofu. So if you don't have a mortar and pestle, by the way, you can do it in a bowl with a dowel. Really, anything that will crush will work really well. Honestly, the best thing that crushes is a mortar and pestle, but if you don't have one, improvise. Or if you really don't have one, you can probably just get a pepper mill, and then just grind it through a pepper mill. You'll notice, by the way, that the Szechuan peppercorn that we're working with is actually in a pepper mill. So when I'm really lazy, I'll skip the mortar and pestle, and then I'll just grind it straight in. But if we're really committed, especially because we're streaming it today, we can do it in a mortar and pestle. And also, this is a really fast dish, so we got plenty of time to do it. Cool. Yeah, so you can't smell it, but I can smell it. This Szechuan peppercorn is very fragrant. A lot more fragrant than it would be if we just added it straight to the wok. So it's an extra, I don't know, like 2 minutes, but makes a whole world of difference if you give that a quick dry toast. And then extra bonus point, but if you have a mortar and pestle, it helps a lot too. All right. So over on the stove, I got my wok. This is going to get heated up. We're going to let that go for maybe another like 30-45 seconds, and we can get going. You have a cast iron mortar and pestle. That's really good. It's heavier than your car. Yeah, that's what I would expect, is that it would be heavier than your car. I would be very curious to see what happens with cast iron mortar and pestle. Because I always assumed at least I assumed the reason that this mortar and pestle is made out of marble, and most of the ones that you see are made out of marble, is because that they have to be made out of a non-porous material. Otherwise, when you crush it, you're crushing stuff into the material, which I would expect would happen with cast iron. But if you own one, it must not be. So, I don't know. I always assumed that's why these things were made out of marble. But yeah, I would expect that it's heavier than your car. I also really would like to get my hands on the molcajete, which is basically the Mexican version of a mortar and pestle, but it's like really, really large. It's like the large size of like a medium-sized mixing bowl. And then what you'll see that happens a lot, not just in Mexican food or Latin American food, but it comes up in a lot of like Thai food and also like Vietnamese food, where they skip the mincing, basically skip all of the chopping, and they just throw it into what essentially is a molcajete, but like the Southeast Asian equivalent of a molcajete. And then they just mash stuff up. And that's how you get like curry pastes and stuff like that. So next on my to purchase list. Things that I don't need though. All right. Next up, we're adding, this is going to be 4 tablespoons of what I believe we're using is grapeseed oil today, because I ran out of peanut oil. Yeah, it looked pretty green. I'm pretty sure that's grapeseed oil. If you don't have grapeseed oil, peanut oil is going to be the best thing to use in a stir fry like this. But if you don't have peanut oil or grapeseed oil, really anything that's good for high heat, so canola oil or vegetable oil, all of those things will work. It's not ideal for wet mixtures. Oh, as long as you keep it dry, clean and dry. Yeah, that makes that kind of adds up. Same behind like a cast iron skillet. But that sounds dope though. I would love to get my hands on a cast iron mortar and pestle. I didn't even know that those existed. That's cool though. All right, so that's the oil going into our wok, and then we're going to start off here first with our aromatics. This is my garlic. Followed by our ginger and the whites of our green onions. So I'm giving that a quick bloom. We're going to give that a little bit of a toss. I like to give it maybe 10 seconds. But really what I'm doing, I'm not actually paying attention to the amount of time that it's in the stove. What I'm more paying attention to is how aromatic it is. So I'm using my nose and we're smelling. When we start smelling garlic and ginger, we're in a good spot. Then here's my ground pork going in. What I'm doing now is just basically breaking up these large clumps. So I like to just sort of give it a little bit of a chop in the bowl so that we don't have large clumps of ground pork going in all at once. That's not super essential, and lots of times when I'm not paying attention, just the whole thing ends up going in. Not the end of the world if you have large chunks of ground mince going into your stir fry, but if you're really paying attention, you can avoid this step, which is basically breaking up all of those big chunks right now. So that's our ground pork going in. I'm going to let that go for, I don't know, like maybe another minute or so. We're going to let that kind of reach about 80% through on most of that pork. Yeah. Cool. So I'm just giving it a couple of quick tosses. You'll notice there's still a lot of pink going on, so I'm going to let some of that pink cook through. You will also notice that cornstarch that we added to our marinade, it's going to start coming into play now. If this did not have that cornstarch in it, we would have overcooked pork by now. So the cornstarch, really, really important. All right. Yeah. And then what I like to do before the tofu gets into the wok, very important before the tofu gets in the wok, is just give it one more run through with the spatula here. This is going to be our last opportunity to really break up any of those large clumps. Once that tofu is in the wok, we're not going to be able to do very much anymore because it's so fragile. So here's our tofu going in. And now that this tofu is in the wok, because we're using soft tofu, we can't really do much else. We can't really shake very aggressively. Really, the only thing that we can do is just really gentle tossing here. But because that tofu is so fragile, we really don't want to do anything more aggressive than that. Otherwise, we're going to run the risk of starting to break up some of those large clumps or big blocks of tofu, which we don't want to do. So there's my sauce going in. And again, I'm being very, very gentle with my tossing now. Soft tofu, as the name implies, is very, very delicate, so we don't want to be too aggressive with that shaking here anymore. Hey, there's Hamcharo. That's Hamcharo, everyone. He gets to eat ramen every time somebody subscribes. So please subscribe and feed Hamcharo because he's a very, very hungry hamster. All right. Next up, this is going to be my frozen peas. I, for one, am a very big proponent of frozen veggies in stir fries like this because what's going to happen, just like we do when we use it in fried rice, is the peas here are going to start defrosting on our residual heat. So we're throwing them in at the very, very end, specifically with the intention to let them sort of come to defrost on their own. And what that's doing is basically making sure that those peas stay nice and crispy. So. There's our cornstarch slurry going in, and you'll notice that once that cornstarch slurry hits the wok, things are going to start tightening up quite a bit. So our stir fry is going to go from like loose and watery to pretty tight and like thick and luxurious, all from that cornstarch. There it goes. Like magic. And that's basically all we have to do here. We don't need to let those peas do very much on the stove at this point. Really, now I'm just waiting for it to reduce just a little bit. I'm going to let that come up. And then the last thing we're going to do is add our toasted Szechuan peppercorn. And then give that one more turn. There are a couple of going theories on like the best way to treat Szechuan peppercorn. I've toyed around with adding it at the very, very end, basically as a garnish. What most, I think like the going consensus is that it blooms out. It's the peppercorn, the oils in the peppercorn bloom out when it hits hot oil. So if you throw it in too early, what the going consensus is that it might bloom too early and then it will get buried into the stir fry. I don't know how much I agree with that. What I do know is that I think it tastes best if you throw it in at the very end of the stir fry, not as a garnish. I find that it gets buried a little bit when you throw it in as a garnish. Alright. Oops, wrong camera. So last thing we're going to do every time that we cook in a carbon steel wok, give that wok a nice good rinse because basically what's happening is once that carbon steel cools down, you're going to have a lot of trouble cleaning it, which is really, really annoying. If you have a good carbon steel wok like this one, it won't warp. You don't need to worry about it warping. It won't crack in the way that, like, you definitely don't want to do this with every kind of pan that you own. You don't want to do this with Teflon. Probably don't even want to do it with stainless steel. But with this particular form of carbon steel, this one's going to work just fine, and it won't crack. But definitely, Teflon pans, don't do this. Otherwise, you will crack the Teflon. All right. So I have read going theories that lots of people go by that say to throw the Szechuan peppercorn in now, which I think is a little bit heavy. A little bit heavy-handed, mostly because I find that the peppercorns, they pop out too much and then you bite into like big chunks of peppercorn because they haven't properly been folded into the stir fry. So, but that's just my opinion. Mess around with it. See what you like. All right. So definitely a couple of things, in my opinion, that are not very authentically Chinese. Definitely chasing, like, in my ongoing effort of chasing my grandma's mapo tofu, which I will never capture. There's definitely a few things in here that are not authentically Chinese. Obviously the big thing being the use of peas. But there's also a couple of other things that we did. Definitely that inclusion of... we included a whole bunch of Japanese mirin. There was a whole bunch of gochujang. All of those things, they don't come from authentically Chinese cuisine. But what they are is adding like a little bit more sweetness and sugariness and brightness in complex ways that I think kind of drive at like how my grandma was making mapo tofu. So I don't think I will ever figure out how she was doing it, but my best attempt. It looks good. Oh yeah, thank you. Cool. So I'm finishing, those are the greens of my green onions. That will do it. So this one, by the way, one of the easier stir fries that I know how to make. I would say is that if you're just getting your feet wet with stir frying or Chinese cooking in general, this is a really good one to take a shot at because it is pretty easy. No doubanjiang, yeah, good question. So we talked about that a little bit earlier too. So definitely in your more like traditional straight ahead Chinese mapo tofu, it would definitely contain a lot of doubanjiang. What I used instead was a little bit of gochujang, which is essentially like the Korean equivalent. It is very, gochujang and doubanjiang I wouldn't say are like the same thing at all. They're not super similar at all, but they are derived and fermented in very similar ways. Essentially, doubanjiang is the fermentation of Chinese chilies. Doubanjiang, same thing, but it's done into a paste and using like more sweeter elements of chili. So what you end up with when you use gochujang is a little bit more sugariness and sweetness in like an interesting and like fermented brightness sort of way. That I think is like gets a little bit closer to how my grandma was making mapo tofu. I'm pretty confident. I don't think my grandma knew what gochujang was because my grandma was like old school Chinese. But I'm pretty sure she was probably just using sugar. I think she was probably just putting spoonfuls of sugar in it, which to me is gross. So what we're using today is instead of that doubanjiang is a tablespoon, 2 tablespoons of gochujang. Plus a little bit of Japanese mirin, which gives you a little bit of brightness and sweetness in interesting ways. So we're basically avoiding the use of just whole spoonfuls of sugar, which I'm fairly confident is how my grandma was doing it, and kind of replacing it with like sweeter elements that come from similar like places of umami. But yeah, good question. Cool. So yeah, that's my best shot at recreating my grandma's mapo tofu, which I will never figure out. She's also passed away many years ago, so I will never know. I genuinely will never know how that mapo tofu was made. Maybe it wasn't as good as I remember, but here we are. Cool. So this, by the way, is the very first recipe that came out over on the YouTube channel. So if you're watching on YouTube, if you scroll all the way back to the very first video that lives over on the Wu Can Cook recipe videos, you'll find like a very grainy and like poorly color corrected video of mapo tofu. This is that recipe. I don't think I changed anything, by the way. I have not adapted this recipe in any way since publishing that first recipe. This is the exact same way that I had done it in that recipe too. If you're looking for that, it already lives over on the YouTube channel. I think at some point I will probably do a more like involved recipe video for that dish because we cook it a lot. But if you have any questions for me, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. I'll still be here doing dishes and stuff, so I know I miss stuff all the time. If you haven't yet, definitely make your way over to the YouTube channel and check out what's going on over there. We've got new stuff coming out every Friday, so tomorrow we have a recipe for a xiaolongbao, which is a Chinese soup dumpling, which is, I think I can confidently say, maybe the hardest thing that I have ever cooked. It is very, very hard to make, and it's also the reason lots of people have been asking me to make one, and I have been avoiding it for a super long time because I always knew that whenever I did attempt it, it would take a really long time. So it is not even necessarily something that I would recommend other people try making, but we did a recipe video for it, and it is coming out. But it was really hard to make. It's like a full 48-hour dish. You have to like make this crazy stock. We basically made gelatin from scratch, which was crazy and also cool, but also like food science is crazy. So that's coming up on Friday, tomorrow, so we're going to take a look at all that stuff. I will not be cooking that one live because it is very difficult to make, but instead this coming Tuesday I'll be cooking something else. We're making curry. Pad Kee Mao. We're doing some Pad Kee Mao, so we're diving back into some chow fun. So, and then we can talk about that recipe video. So we're working our way up to 5,500 subs by the end of the month, so if you want to help us hit our subscriber goal, please hop over and subscribe. Cool. All right, that's it, everyone. I'll see you soon. Bye.
If you think that you don't know, never mind that you still don't love yourself. No, you can find it from somebody else. No, everybody's got to grow up sometime. Funny how we shoot the move, still will we fight it, baby? Alright, never mind. Yes, I found it now. I'm finally in love with love, and it's bringing me down. sweet as strawberry wine. Ooh, you're as warm as a glass of bed. Darling, I'll stay the storm on your love all the time. You're as smooth as Tennessee whiskey. You're as sweet as strawberry wine. You're as warm as a glass of brandy. Darling, I'll stay stone on your love all the time.